This evening's talk is by our chairman, Robin Bynoe. Robin's been chairman for what, about 6 years now, I should think, isn't it, Robin? And Robin's going to talk to us about The Fisher King, AP's last novel. Robin, over to you, I think.
Thank you, Keith. First of all, apologies to everybody for cancelling this talk last month, at the last minute. It became necessary to have COVID. One thing about the intervening month is that it's given me the opportunity to reread Fisher King again, which is either the 5th or the 6th time. And I have to say that it gets better, as far as I'm concerned, at any rate, with each rereading. The second general point to make is that there will be no overhead slides tonight. I don't like slides. I noticed that Lance Butler and Simon Barnes in the annual lecture managed very well without, so I thought I would do the same. I was persuaded to prepare some slides for this talk this evening, but they turned out to be of such extraordinary banality that I put my foot down and said, maybe we won't. I was then told that the members expect slides, and that if we didn't have slides, some of them might resign. All I can say is that if any of you feel like resigning, just let me know and I will send you the rejected slides, and we'll be happy. This is the first talk of a projected 7-talk series about the 7 non-dance novels, the 7 standalone novels. 7 novels is quite a substantial achievement. It's one more than Jane Austen managed, and Jane Austen didn't have to put dance in the middle of hers. But they've always been slightly put to one side by people considering Powell's work, because everybody goes for dance first. The specific reason for our concern was that Penguin Random House, who have the rights to Powell's novels, decided that they would not do any more physical publications of the 7 novels after they'd run out of the ones that they have in stock. They would continue with Kindle, but not with physical ones. There was a bit of a minor outcry, and Philip Hensher helped by badgering Penguin Random House. How it's ended up, I think, is fairly satisfactory, which is that the University of Chicago Press, who do splendid looking, although slightly more expensive versions of the 7 novels in America, are going to make them available here as well. So it's a good outcome, but not an ideal outcome. When we were talking about all of this and what we could do about it, Nick Burns said that he thought that it was really the job of the society to make a bit more noise about the 7 novels. We talk endlessly about dance, we don't talk about the 7 novels. And this is the first of 7 talks, I hope. One of them is going to be Nick Burns talking about agents and patients, on which he has extremely heterodox views. And at the end, if the talks are any good, I would like to publish them in a book published by the Society as a modest contribution to writings about Powell. Coincidentally, when Philip Hensher was giving his lecture in 2021, he was extremely enthusiastic about the 7 novels, and particularly about From a View to a Death. Anyway, that's the background, and now à nos moutons, as we say here, The Fisher King. My mother was an enthusiastic Powellian. I introduced her to the work in 1966, and as she got older, I tended to buy the new releases for her. Shortly before her death, we were talking about him. She said, "I loved all the novels, except the last one. That was unnecessary." The word unnecessary conveyed a great deal to one of her class and generation, mainly sexual. "The Fisher King," I said, "the one on the ship." "Oh no, I don't think so," she said, with a vagueness becoming one in her 90s. And she shut her eyes. She meant, of course, Hearing Secret Harmonies and the unnecessary goings-on orchestrated by Scorpio Murtlock around the Standing Stones. She'd forgotten about the one on the ship, if indeed she had read it. I mention in passing that I had written that passage about my mother as a Powellian before Simon Barnes's talk, in which he talks about his father as a Powellian, and I thought that I wouldn't take it out, so you must regard it as a Powellian trope. Maybe it'll turn up again. Hilary Spurling, in her biography of Powell, is similarly contemptuous. She dismisses "Oh, How the Wheel Becomes It" in 4 sentences and says that The Fisher King is even worse. A very brief description of the plot of The Fisher King is mildly inaccurate. I wonder, as with my mother, if she read it at all. We all get tired, as she was saying in that passage as the biography approaches its end, about Powell. I bought a second-hand copy of the novel from Abe Books in anticipation of this talk, one that I could annotate. Inside it, there is a dedication. Damien, I'm working on the principle that no book with this title can be bad. Hope I'm right. Love, Im. What on earth was Im expecting? She at any rate appears unaware that the novel that she had bought is nothing but an appendage to the glorious dance sequence. Her dedication precedes, because it's dated, the Terry Gilliam film, so she wasn't thinking of that. Did Damien agree that the book was up to snuff? Did she read it too? We can't know. The fact that it was for sale on Abe Books may be a clue. On the other hand, it was 30 years ago, and Damien may in the meantime have been gathered to his father's, leaving executives to dispose of the stock. In short, The Fisher King is a bit of an orphan. I like it very much. I should say at once that I have no killer app to persuade you that you should too, but an accumulation of detail, what Walter Sickert called echo, and analogy, which I find compelling. It occurs to me just in the context of the 7 novels that I'm going to be talking a little bit about the characters in the book and the plot. And if I were to do that in a talk about dance, you would feel very insulted because you know all the characters in dance and you know the plot and you don't need anybody to tell you. And the 7 novels are different in that respect. When he returned to writing fiction after an 8-year gap during which he wrote the memoirs, Powell had a dilemma not shared by those who start every novel from scratch. It is illustrated by a conversation that I had once with Doug Naylor, the writer of Red Dwarf, about the problems of creating a television sitcom. Red Dwarf has been running on and off for 34 years, since 1988, the period of Dance's creation, and about half as much again. And Red Dwarf is still going. After the start of the 2nd series of a sitcom, Doug said, if it's any good, a character has only to appear and the audience laughs. In the 1st series, no one yet knows who the character is and what's funny about them, and people demand immediately to be seduced. A roman fleuve is not a sitcom, but there are parallels. Hearing Secret Harmonies is full of shocks, but at least we know what we expect from the characters, or some of them. When Jean and Bob Duport reappear at the end, we regard them as old friends, in spite of the unspeakable things that they have done in earlier volumes. It's like the Second World War. If you personally survived, a glow of nostalgia was permitted. People remembered Vera Lynn rather than Belsen or Dresden. Dance casts a long shadow onto the subsequent novels, and not in a good way. Oh, How the Wheel Becomes It, the first of the 2 final standalone novels, is absolutely uncompromising. The characters are nasty. The writing on the opening page or 2 is as turgid as anything that I've read this side of Noam Chomsky. It certainly doesn't seduce you. The title is borderline insane. He could have started with a nice bit of impressionistic prose, or had a brief walk-on for Dickie Umfrewell, but Powell went for broke. It was even a novella, a form that everyone hates, publishers and readers alike. I love Wheel, and I'm looking forward to hearing Colin Donald's thoughts on it. The Fisher King is not disagreeable like Wheel, but it is also uncompromising. The style is as idiosyncratic, or as non-Powellians say, arch, and as anti-Powellians say, pompous, as ever. The very first paragraph contains this sentence: "He liked extracting pungent overplus from superficially unpromising essences." Later we get, "By now, he had a finger in various pies replenished with appetizing ingredients." Overplus, replenished. Simon Barnes tells me, reminds me, as he generously puts it, that the word overplus appears in Shakespeare's sonnets. I don't think that that is an excuse. The dialogue is about as realistic, taken sentence by sentence, as Ivy Compton Burnett's, but we are now used to that from Wheel. In Dance, by contrast, the dialogue is surprisingly terse and parche trapnel, realistic. The scenes where Valentine Beals pontificates to his wife and the Middlecotes with interjections from them are conveyed almost entirely in dialogue, which is quite unlike Dance. As to the content, there is only one character that you could call nice. Many of them, even the sympathetic ones, are bores. Half are consumed by ambition, and the others are prepared to sit, watch, judge, and theorize, just like in Dance. The novel is set on a cruise ship. It is to sail around the British Isles, putting in at sites of archaeological interest. It is rather a highbrow cruise. There are appropriately qualified lecturers on board. The ship is called Alecto. Here is what Wikipedia, channeling Hesiod, has to say about that name. Alecto was the daughter of Gaia, fertilized by the blood spilled from Uranus when Kronos castrated him. She had snakes for hair and blood dripped from her eyes, while her wings were those of bats. Alecto's job as a fury is castigating the moral crimes of humans. She is, in other words, a kindly one, and we are not in for an easy ride. Cruises around Britain exist, and Powell and Lady Violet went on one with Swan Hellenic. Lady Violet did watercolors, and he satisfied his passion for prehistoric archaeology, which you will know about from his collection of journalism on the subject, entitled King Arthur and Other Personages, and published by the Society. Choosing a trip that takes you out past Orkney and Shetland, rather than the more popular ones pottering around the Med in the sunshine, is probably a sign of classiness, if not actually class. People sometimes complain that the world of dance is too small. This is an aspect of the great coincidence debate. The world on a cruise ship is, of course, infinitely smaller. If someone bursts through a cabin door, inwards or outwards, it's odds on that it's someone we know quite well. To make things even more focused, none of the crew gets a look in the Fisher King, and there is a suggestion that those passengers invited only perfunctorily to dine at the captain's table will not feature much either. Even the captain, incidentally, fails to achieve a walk-on part. There is never the possibility of a deus ex machina. Not only is it a small world, but you could look up the name of everyone in it on the passenger list. In this respect, if no other, it differs from real life. As a result, characters are forced into each other's company long after they would ideally have appreciated a break. Much of the book comprises Valentine Beals, of whom more anon, holding forth to his wife and to the Middlecotes, their companions on the voyage, about his Arthurian theories, when they've all plainly had quite enough of them. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a play called Huis Clos. When I was at school in the early 60s, it was absolutely part of the canon. It has since slipped, I think. The characters of Huis Clos were stuck together in a room for eternity. It was a one-act play, appropriately without an interval. Sartre's perception was that hell was other people. Occasionally, the Fisher King feels like Sartre on the open wave as the characters relentlessly grind away at each other. Sartre, incidentally, always seems to me to be closer to Femme Seneschal in Temporary Kings than the universally assumed Merleau-Ponty. At any rate, Powell certainly knew all about him. A comparison with Huis Clos that occurs to me in passing is The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, Powell's favorite novel by his friend Evelyn Waugh. There, the main character, also confined on a ship, goes to pieces quite unassisted by other people, unless you count the hallucinated voices from the BBC. All of the action in The Fisher King takes place on the ship, except for 3 outings on shore, all fraught with drama. One of my favorite non-series novels by P.G. Wodehouse is The Luck of the Bodkins. Most of the action there also takes place on a passenger ship. At the end, there is a scene in a hotel room, they've disembarked, where all the characters say their piece, including the steward, who is called Albert Eustace Peasmarsh, and all is resolved. It reads as if the book were first conceived as one of Wodehouse's musicals, and in the hotel room scene, the characters would have had a verse each in an ensemble number. There is just such a scene at the end of Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. Would The Fisher King have made an opera? Undoubtedly, not a musical and not a play, but an opera, something Wagnerian. Enough of ships as a device for intensifying the action. What then is the story? I'm assuming that you've read it and partly forgotten. I won't avoid spoilers, but I will not reveal the ending. Essentially, it is very simple. An unlikely couple are on board. The others observe them. There are suggestions that the couple's time together is drawing to a close. There are candidates to pick up the pieces. Things do not fall out as expected. It's as simple as that. What matters, of course, is less what happens than how it is seen and interpreted by the surrounding passengers, and particularly by Valentine Beals, who has some claim to being the main character, and who sees or affects to see matters through an Arthurian lens. Just like Dance, but more emphatically, it is a novel about how what matters is not what happens objectively, but how it is seen, remembered, experienced, and described by the people affected. It also reinforces another idea from Dance. As one of the characters in Fisher King puts it, have you never noticed that writers function largely by not knowing what the world is like at all from one point of view, perhaps very well from another? I think that's a very important idea, both from the point of view of the Fisher King and Powell's fiction generally. But in order to look at that, it is necessary to have a brief view of the essential dramatis personae. Saul Henchman is the center of attention on the cruise. He is a successful photographer with a colorful and vividly sexual past. He was badly injured during the war, leaving his face monstrously disfigured and his mobility limited to crutches. He is frequently in pain. In order better to take photographs, he uses shoulder crutches rather than those that grip the elbow. Nowadays, it is a point of principle in medical circles in England never to prescribe shoulder crutches as being unacceptably American. Maybe it was different then. He is seen proceeding hazardously, occasionally falling, propelled by his crutches, cameras swinging from around his neck. As a result of his injuries, he is also impotent. He can be intolerably rude, but people tend to put up with that because he is famous and potentially useful to them. Irascible, funny, wounded, basically kind, an incontestably brilliant artist. He sometimes reminds me of Evelyn Waugh, although he's less tubby than Evelyn Waugh. Henchman is accompanied by Barbarina Rookwood. She is much younger and ethereally beautiful. She was on the verge of a great career as a ballet dancer when she met Henchman and gave it all up for him. As a result, she is a figure of mystery and a source of speculation. They are both necessarily sexual abstainers. Unicorns are mentioned by those Arthurianically inclined. This is the couple around whom the vultures are circling. Valentine Beals is a popular novelist. He is accompanied on the cruise by his wife Louise and their friends the Middlecotes. He has recently written a historical novel about King Arthur and his court. It's called Lancelot's Love Feast. And he is full of his research into Arthuriana. He convinces himself that Henchman is the Fisher King of the Arthurian legend. The Fisher King of the legend was also hideously maimed and impotent. Consequently, the king being the land and the land being the king, his kingdom languished, crops failed, and so on. His people no doubt wished that he was a slightly more temporary king. His only possible pastime was fishing. There was a test by which his faculties might be restored, but Percival, Wagner's Parsifal, passing by in search of the Grail and too full of himself to notice, blew it. A comparison that occurs to me in passing as regards the crushes and the cameras is the novel Lord of Light, written by the American poet and science fiction writer Roger Zelazny. There, a spaceship crashes onto a planet and the passengers, who are considerably more evolved than the indigenous inhabitants, take on, partly for their own amusement and partly in order to exercise power, the archetypal identities, aspects, and attributes of members of the Hindu pantheon. I thought of this the first time the henchman lurches out, aspect, crutches and camera swinging, attribute, in impersonation of the Fisher King archetype. Zelazny, like Huis Clos, is much more part of the cultural world when Powell wrote The Fisher King than he is now. There's no reason to think that Powell had read Lord of Light, but it's nice to think of him and Zelazny struggling in their very different milieu towards the same truth. There is no doubt that Powell had something of all this in mind. Here is the narrator. In the context of henchmen, Beals might be envisaged standing or kneeling in the corner of an old master painting in the role of donor, where, making a reverential gesture, he points to henchmen as the paramount figure, mysterious, dominating, tormented, displaying a wounded body, holding in one hand a camera, proclaiming his profession, and the other, the fishing tackle emblematic of his regal counterpart. When I first read The Fisher King in 1986, I was strongly struck by the comparison with Lord of Light. Now I am less so. Of the characters, only henchman has his attributes in quite the required way, and we can assume that Powell hadn't read Zelazny. Nevertheless, it does tell us something about the way that people, with a view to their audience, adopt characteristic poses, paraphernalia, and ways of carrying on in order to become more powerful, a truly Powellian concern. Beals also identifies another Arthurian character, the loathly damsel, in the character Dr. Lorna Tiptoft. Dr. Tiptoft is significant in terms of the plot. She's rude, bossy, and hideous. She dresses appallingly. A conspicuously holiday outfit, butcher blue knickerbockers, a man's check cap with a peak. She was evidently unhandicapped by humor. She does not have hidden debts, nor do her parents with whom she is traveling, but they are quite funny to watch. No doubt in his patronage of the cruise liners, Powell met some monsters, perhaps was stuck next to them at the captain's table, and he was glad of an opportunity to mock them in his turn. Beals's wife, Louise, is the only character in the book that one might want to spend time with. She keeps herself to herself, giggles a lot, reads books, and when she says anything, it is perceptive. Persons to whom she had taken a dislike rarely noticed that they were being teased unless possessing susceptive antennae, the narrator tells us. The Middlecotes are unattractive. He is in advertising, on which he pontificates in jargon. Possibly Powell wants us to consider an ad man's worldview, just as he looks at the world of Beals as a popular novelist. If so, it is, I think, undeveloped, possibly because Powell was too fastidious to know much about advertising. Perhaps it is a deliberate example of the writers not knowing what the world is like at all from one point of view. Gary Lamont is one of the vultures as regards Barbarina. He is a successful editor of a newspaper and has uncharacteristically taken time out to join the cruise in order to win her. Powell notoriously didn't understand what Sir Magnus Donners did for a living, and he is as ignorant about Lamont, who was presented as a tycoon and also as an editor. These roles are rarely combined. Lord Black of Crosshaven and latterly the Federal Correctional Institute (brackets low security brackets) in Sumter County, Florida, was a proprietor. William Deeds was an editor. They do different things. Proprietors have more money, or at any rate more credit. Lamont is made to spout a lot of commercial jargon, much of which simply does not ring true. He's not a successful character. Having said that, it occurs to me that the one thing that Powell did know about was newspapers, since working for them was his day job for much of his life. He knew that William Deeds and Malcolm Muggeridge, a close friend for heaven's sake, were not city slickers. Maybe he is making a subtle point about artificial worlds, but I don't think so, and I'm not convinced at any level by Lamont, and I'm not alone in that. Maybe it's as simple as this. After all those Tollans, Powell was just wanted to create a character called Gary. Robin Gilson is a young man with a muscular degenerative disease. He's on board with his mother. Both Saul Henchman and Barbarina Rookwood take a fancy to him in their different ways. Notwithstanding his feeble aspect, he turns out to have an unattractive determination to get his own way. He has a will of steel, the willfulness, we are told, of the indulged child. Mr. Jack, an infinitely faded philanderer. He is a garrulous drunk who endlessly recycles tales of his sexual conquest long ago. He is a sad coda to Jenkins and Morland's speculations about the life of Don Juan, whose name, of course, he echoes. The social circle of the Electo is sufficiently confined that much of the story is taken up with other characters avoiding being stuck with him at the bar or table. Hui Clo again. Like others of Powell's bores, he has a diabolical side. In the end, he finds redemption of a sort. Incidentally, for those who like that sort of thing, one of Mr. Jack's stories from long ago, which is important in the plot, revolves around his having fallen in love with a streetwalker, an episode which also features in the memoirs of Powell's close friend, Adrian Daintree. I hoped to discover that the two women shared the same pitch, but they didn't. They're both in Soho, Fitzrovia borders, but they're about half a mile apart. Talking of Morland, there is a strange musical element. There are two American men with moustaches, blazers, and t-shirts. The t-shirt of one reads basically Bach, and the others marginally Mahler. They are overheard talking obsessively about music in, like Lamont's city jargon, an unconvincing manner. But what on earth is going on? Have they got separated from a musical convention? There's no sign of one. And the t-shirts, which are never changed, must they not have smelt a bit by the time they got to Orkney? Or did they have a trunk full of clean ones? And if so, why? One feels that one is nudging up against the limits of naturalism here. Finally, there is the question of the narrator. We have an impersonal narrator, but not an omniscient one. Much of what we are told is filtered through the subjective reminiscences of the characters, as in Dance, and mainly through the speculations of Beales, informed or otherwise by Sir Thomas Malory. Sometimes the focus shifts dramatically, again as in Dance, and after pages of Beales's musings about Henchman and Rookwood, there we are in their cabin getting a Horatio Rector, mainly because it's Powell, and we are so much used to Nick's voice, we feel the need of a human reporter. Much of what we are told is, as I say, in the form of back chat across the dinner table shared by the Bealeses and the Middlecotes. It feels as if we are being kept up to date by someone sitting there too. I wondered if it might be Louise Beales, but that's probably fanciful. One of the successes of Dance is how Powell imagined the professional world of music. It is something that he knew nothing about, except through his friendship with Constant Lambert, and about which, apart from Lambert, cared less. It is wholly convincing, while some feel that the ruminations in books do furnish a room about writing novels, about which he cared very deeply indeed, do go on a bit. In The Fisher King, much space is given to the ins and outs of photography. Henchman is a very good photographer. Other characters are also photographers, but less good at it. One, we are fairly certain, is rather bad. Barbarina Rookwood's artistry as a ballet dancer is stressed. The scene where she dances is the one moment of transcendent art in the whole book. So far as I know, Powell knew little about either photography or ballet, although he presumably knew Margot Fonteyn from Concert Lambert, but his treatment of the two art forms seems to me to be spot on. Closer to home is Valentine Beals, the popular novelist, specifically the popular historical novelist. Powell had, of course, already created a novelist about whose work we are intended to feel queasy, St. John Clarke. But Beals is a notch or two below Clarke. He is never reviewed, and his readers are entirely non-highbrow. Ada Lightwoodin would have had nothing to do with him, even if he were dead, and even if there were not the contractual connection. In the journals, Powell says that he thinks of Beals' books as like Dennis Wheatley's, though the character is nothing like Wheatley, whom Powell didn't know. Dennis Wheatley, incidentally, was an enthusiastic supporter of the resolutely intellectual novelist Rose Macaulay, so like Beals, he was probably dumbing down consciously for his audience. I asked John Powell whether AP ever slummed it by reading popular fiction. He told me that Lady Violet certainly did. Powell liked some detective fiction and had a full set of Raymond Chandler. That doesn't help us enormously. Philip Marlowe is a world away from all this. Beals may write bad novels, but he has a novelist's instincts. He takes the raw material in front of him, the goings-on the Electo's saloons and cabins, and forces it by way of his own unique imagination through an Arthurian mincer. Had his last book been a tale of the English Civil War, say, rather than Lancelot's love feast, his analysis would have been completely different. The analogy with the Fisher King of legend is incomplete, as he admits, but it amuses him. Henchman, the putative Fisher King, and Dr. Tiptoff, the putative loathly damsel, never for a moment realize the roles that they are supposed to be occupying, but we do. The book, being a novel, is a work of imagination, and whether we like it or not, the imagination is Arthurian, increasingly so as it gets colder and the Electo sails further and further from the soft south and nearer to Ultima Thule. Ultima Thule, incidentally, the origin of the name is a Norwegian word pronounced Thule. Edgar Allan Poe, we are told in the novel, pronounced it Thule. I shall treat it as an English word and follow Kingsley Amis's prescription that imported words are to be pronounced as Englishly as possible. Garage, not garage. Thule, not Thule. I like the way that when they leave the ship to inspect Hadrian's Wall, Beals gives way to Il Miglio Fabbro, and the imaginative world of Puckercook's Hill takes over until they are safely back on board. I also like the way that Beals is constantly aware of the limitations to the imaginations of his readers, but expects his friends, and so us, to try a little harder. Here he is talking of Barbarina Rookwood's ethereal loveliness. For my regular readers, he says, Dresden porcelain is the phrase I should not hesitate to use. The comparison is hard to resist among friends with whom, so far as humanly possible, one hopes to avoid the more tarnished cliches. We should not forget that Nick Jenkins was also a novelist. Powell dumped a succession of circumstances on him, and Nick interpreted them for us. As a novelist, he gave priority to what he found diverting or funny or otherwise significant. As a novelist, he was not above taking someone and rendering them in 2 dimensions for the sake of a laugh or to jolly the narrative along. One point of my novel, The Ordeals of Captain Jenkins, is to suggest that he did precisely that with Uncle Giles, who, I suggest, had a hinterland brutally ignored by Nick. Beals does this too. For all we know, the loathly damsel had her sensitive side. King Arthur was important to Powell, as you will know if you've read King Arthur and Other Personages. He was able to view him and his entourage around his round table through at least 3 different imaginative lenses. The first was that of history. Powell was prepared to accept a case for Arthur's being a post-Roman warrior chieftain, with more or less exact birth and death dates, and a trajectory of military success followed by failure. Secondly, the Arthurian myth was an important part of the psychic makeup of the British. who tended to explain events in public or private life by reference to Arthurian legend. We do that less these days, now that we have the mythologies served up oven ready by Hollywood, but it is a long game. Finally, there's Arthurian fantasy. Powell regarded Mallory as such, and he was delighted to discover the depiction of King Arthur in Otranto Cathedral, seated on a goat and fighting a giant cat. This, of course, is Beals's game. In The Fisher King, taken as a whole, we have all three. In Dance, Nick and his friends spend much of their conversations bouncing things that they have seen or heard of against mythological or literary archetypes. In The Fisher King, Powell says in terms, and in the first paragraph, that the twin intertwined subjects of the novel are henchmen and the archetypal Fisher King. A question of upbringing starts with all those centaurs. The first sentence of The Fisher King reads, "Exile is the wound of kingship," which is uncompromising enough, whatever it means. And all this is done through Beals's fussy but serviceable and often illuminating imagination. And of course, it doesn't go to plan. Towards the end, Beals thinks that maybe Barbarina Rookwood, whom he has lazily categorized as an Arthurian virgin, lovely and untouched, a bit unicorn-like, is not in fact classifiable in those terms and may have been the main character after all. Louise Beals, as always several steps ahead, has realized from the outset that Barbarina Rookwood is the more interesting figure. More importantly, after 3/4 of a book full of gossip, allusion, jokes, and showing off, both Henchman and Rookwood behave, when it all comes apart, in a way which is dignified, strange, un-Arthurian, and very moving. The last paragraph echoes the end of Casanova's Chinese restaurant, the ghost railway, and the hurtling towards the body on the line. It also echoes the gale of imprecations from Burton at the very end of Dance. Here it is. The rain had abated a little, though not altogether. In spite of foul weather, there was exhilaration in the northern air. The leaden surface of the loch was just perceptibly heaving in the wind, still blowing from time to time in fairly strong gusts. On the far side of the waters, low rounded hills, soft and mysterious, concealed in luminous haze, the frontiers of Thule, the edge of the known world, man's permitted limits, a green barriered checkpoint, beyond which the fearful cataract of torrential seas cascaded down into chaos. They were the last words of fiction that Powell uttered. And I hope I've said enough to suggest that you should investigate whether perhaps Hilary Spurling got it wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, questions for Robin, comments, please. If you want to speak, then please raise your hand in the reactions and I'll try to come to everybody in turn. Paul, first of all.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. For those on this call, I'd point you towards Michael Barber's biography, not Hilary Spurling's, because Barber is actually much more generous towards the Fisher King, and he quotes those who reviewed it very favourably, including John Bailey, Malcolm Bradbury, and A.S. Byatt. Interestingly, I think he makes the point, he quotes Henchman, who says that yeah, he was always surrounded. He was, in terms of for women, he was sympathetic to women, and Barber points out that T.S. Eliot's crippled flatmate, John Hayward, was of interest to Powell because, quote, at parties he was always surrounded by pretty women, his somewhat terrifying manner and appearance notwithstanding. And I think this goes back to Jimmy Brent and others, where Powell's sort of interest in those that wouldn't normally be seen as glamorous figures seem to have an attraction for women. So I'd recommend the two. I mean, Barber gives it 2 pages and other references as well, and he's quite complimentary about the Fisher King.
Thank you, Paul. I'd forgotten that.
Anybody else? Anything else?
I mean, just to comment further on that, the book is full of both men and women being attracted to opposite numbers who nobody would have predicted. So there is at the center of it, there's Henchman and Barbarina. Then there is Barbarina's fascination with Robin Gilson. And then there is Robin Gilson's fascination with the loathly damsel.
Yeah.
And the one person who everybody expects to come in and whisk Barbarina off her feet is the tycoon Gary Lamont, who retires in complete disarray.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Well, there are echoes for that as well in other places in Powell. I mean, I'm thinking of Zooch. I'm thinking of Widmerpool, Gypsy Jones, even, I guess.
Yes,
so
indeed.
yeah, there are echoes elsewhere, I think. One thing you say, you comment on Powell and knowledge of photography. It's not really surprising that he got that right, because John Powell is himself a good photographer. So he would have got a certain amount of, inside information from John, I'm sure.
I think it goes further than that. I think that I mean, I'm always very much struck by the way that that Powell invents a musical world in Casanova's Chinese Restaurant, and when there are other worlds that he could have invented, like the world of that there are novelists in dance. But there's very little about the stage, and Powell was more obsessed with Shakespeare than almost anything. But he set out to create a musical world which was completely unsympathetic to him, and I think it's one of the triumphs of dance. And I suspect that he took on photography and ballet in the same way as a challenge. And I mean, there may be things I'm missing, and maybe that he was a balletter main. I've not heard that.
I mean, the musical side in dance certainly surely would largely have come from Constant Lambert.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, it's not just the music; it's also the music world. I mean, the way that they talk about the music industry when they're in the Morton or wherever it is at the beginning of Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. I mean, that all rings extremely true to me, and it's not something that Powell would have done if it weren't for his friendship with Lambert.
I mean, Gerald is asking in the chat, what significance is there to Henchman's name? Is there any that we know of? Anybody?
Not that's occurred to me, no.
No, okay. Prue was waving her hand as well. You're on mute, Prue. Press the space bar and hold it down.
Oh, space bar.
No, you're still on. You should. You've gone back again. You're okay at the moment. You should be okay, Prue.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was only going to say that at the exhibition at the Wallace, there was a letter from Benjamin Britten in which he apologizes for having not written in answer to Powell's query or asking him to comment on the musical references, and Britain obviously was not prepared to do this and rather brushed it aside. And but Britain did write this letter, and clearly didn't have much to say. So that
I mean, he did get people to help him with I mean, for example, Alison Lurie regularly helped him with dialogue from Americans, and I think that rings very true. As I've said before, I think his take on the business world is extremely approximate. I mean, there's that fascinating sentence that I quoted about how a writer knows absolutely nothing of life in some areas and a very great deal in others. I don't think that Powell minded. I mean, I think he found it amusing to create an extremely peculiar businessman, the man who is both an editor and a proprietor, which doesn't exist in real life. What's the other example? Never mind. Yeah, but I think that he tried to do that on the basis of very little background knowledge. The other example I was thinking of was Milliken as an advertising man. We have the world of the advertising man and the advertising man's take on international affairs, and I don't think he thought about it very deeply, and I don't think it works at all. I don't think it matters, and I don't think he thought it mattered. I think he was quite prepared to have, you know, boss shots in novels of this sort, so long as there were some ones that hit home.
Noreen.
I'd say that Atwood and museum curators is another example, actually. I don't find him in the least convincing as a museum curator. I know AP was a trustee of the National Portrait Gallery, but the National Portrait Gallery is a little bit niche.
Well, and he was friends with the director of the Wallace.
Yes, but the Wallace is also arguably a little bit niche. I don't think he actually probably knew enough people from museums to give you a rounded picture of a... People who work in museums are completely bonkers, to be honest with you. They're a bit more interesting, Mr. Atwood, for my money. But
were they in the 1930s, though?
Yes, worse.
But I mean, knowing somebody at trustee level is quite different from knowing somebody who actually polishes the exhibits, isn't it?
Well, yes, and does all the 93,000 other things you do in museums.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I hadn't thought of that, but not that it's a world that I know as well as you do, of course.
I mean, we can extend that to all sorts of Powell's characters. I mean, how does Zouche again stack up as a painter, and the painter's world? I mean, I don't know, but we could extend that to lots of the worlds.
I mean, I find Zouche convincing as a painter, but I mean, as a bad painter, which is what he is.
Yeah. Okay. And anything from anybody else? Paul.
Yeah, just a quick one to Robin. What particularly appeals to you about the book, Robin?
It's a book about it's a book about the nuts and bolts of the things that novels are about. So it's about, as I say, I mean, you get it in dance as well, but what matters is not what you can describe in flat prose. It's what people think is happening, and it takes it to a degree far beyond anything in dance by having somebody who is momentarily become obsessed with King Arthur, and who decides to interpret what he sees going on the other side of the saloon through an Arthurian lens, and then to try and persuade all his friends that that's what's happening. Okay. And it's something that we've all done, particularly in circumstances like cruise ships. Not that I've ever been on a cruise ship, but in circumstances where it's a slightly closed world, and you're bored, and you start making up fantasies about other people. I mean, school, for example, is precisely where that sort of thing happens.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Graham.
Yes, thanks, Robin. Enjoyable talk. We'll all have fun looking at parallels between characters and real life. Do you see a parallel between Barberina and Henchman and Margot Fonteyn and Roberto Arias, who were sort of in the news at that period of time? She gave up her career, I think I'm right in saying, for him, and then returned when Nureyev showed up. I think that's about how it worked. Has that occurred to you?
That is something that I've seen said, yes, and I've forgotten where it was. I suppose so, but I mean, I've no idea how well Powell knew Margot Fonteyn. I mean, presumably he met her through Lambert, although Lambert was being fairly cagey about his relationship with her at the time. And if it emerges through Moreland in dance, it's very, very oblique indeed. I suppose it might be. I mean, I really don't know enough about Margot Fonteyn. It might have been something that inspired him, but I think
the virginity wasn't a factor either.
Not unless we were misinformed about Constance Lambert. I think one of the things that that John Powell said to me once when we were talking about specifically about the voyage around the British Isles that Powell and Lady Violet took, and the people who crop up in the novel, and I said, you know, to what extent do you think that the people he met on the boat became characters in the novel? And he said, well, no doubt there's a lot of that, but he said, my father wasn't stupid, and everything is very, very, very well disguised. I'm quite sure that some of the real monsters, who are not important from the point of view of the plot, are just people he's been stuck next to at the captain's table and wanted to get his own back.
Incidentally, if anybody wants to get a bit of the real picture of that cruise that the Powells did, get hold of a copy of A Stone in the Shade, the fourth volume of Lady V's autobiography.
Or indeed, King Arthur and other personages.
Indeed so, yes.
The money into the society's coffers.
In both cases, because we still have a few copies of A Stone in the Shade.
We do indeed. I mean, Powell was fascinated by King Arthur. As I said in the talk, he's fascinated at every level. He's one of the most trusting of commentators on historical matters because he's prepared to believe in anybody. So he, I think at one stage, he credits King Arthur with actual birth and death dates, when in the 1960s, when he was writing, everybody was determined that the man didn't exist at all. But he also thinks that Arthur is incredibly important because it's part of the shared mythology of the British, and also it's a source of wonderful fantasy. You know, the whole round table stuff.
This is also, I suspect, partly a jibe, I mean, perhaps unconscious, at the medieval heraldic, you know, trait of tracing people's ancestry back to Adam and Eve and Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea, and, you know, all sorts of connections that are absolutely totally impossible to prove. You know, yeah. Anybody else? Anything else?
Talking of which, and this is entirely nothing at all to do with Powell, but my brother, who is also an amateur genealogist, has just established that that we are related to the Mona Lisa on my father's side.
Excellent. Excellent.
I'm not going to investigate too closely because I'm much too pleased.
I wouldn't. But it's amazing, isn't it? And you know what sort of curiosities you turn up when you do delve into your family's past. Yeah. You know, surprising number of people find they've got murderers or skeletons or, you know. Yeah. Okay. Anything else from anybody else? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, let's draw to a close. We haven't got any more dates for these calls yet. That's with Paul. We've got a social call on the 25th of March at midday for those who wish or can make it. Paul, Robin, any final comments, updates from you?
No, all I would say is those on the call who volunteered to do talks on the standalone novels, please let me know the dates, your preferred dates. Thank you.
Have we got anyone for Due to a Death yet?
Not yet, no. Philip Hensher hasn't confirmed yet.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Robin, anything from you? Final words? No. No. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to Robin for an interesting diversion this evening. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.